This is a fictional story inspired by real life. Richard Sterling felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he recognized a hauntingly familiar silhouette on a crowded corner near Times Square in New York City. The 8 long years of relentless searching, the private investigators who led him to dead ends, the countless newspaper advertisements, and the sleepless nights filled with agonizing silence seemed to culminate in this single devastating moment. There she stood, Felicity, his wife who had vanished without a trace, sitting on the cold, damp pavement with 2 identical young girls who looked to be about 7 years old. She was holding a tattered piece of cardboard with words blurred by the relentless gray drizzle, while the children huddled close to her side, wearing faded clothes that had long ago lost their vibrant colors. Richard slammed on his brakes, causing his luxury sedan to screech to a halt a few yards ahead, ignoring the immediate chorus of angry horns from the frantic Manhattan traffic. His hands trembled violently on the steering wheel as he stared through the windshield at a scene that threatened to shatter his very soul and reality. How was it possible that his beautiful, intelligent wife was now reduced to this state of absolute desperation and public poverty? Felicity had disappeared while she was pregnant with their first child, but in all his years of searching, he had never known that he was actually the father of twin girls. My God, Felicity, he whispered under his breath, feeling a stinging heat of tears beginning to cloud his vision as the world outside turned into a blur of neon and rain. He stepped out of the car with no regard for the chaos he was causing in the middle of the busy thoroughfare, leaving the door slightly ajar as he moved toward the sidewalk. The other drivers continued to honk their horns in irritation, but Richard could only see the broken remnants of his family huddled together and begging for scraps from indifferent strangers. Every step he took toward them felt like an eternity, his legs feeling heavy like lead as he crossed the distance that had separated them for nearly a decade. As he drew closer, Felicity lifted her weary, sunken eyes for a brief moment, and Richard prayed that she would recognize him, that she would run into his arms. Instead, what he saw in those once bright eyes was nothing but pure, unadulterated fear and the defensive instinct of a cornered animal protecting its young. "Please, sir, just a few cents or some spare change to help me feed my daughters," Felicity said in a raspy, tired voice that lacked any hint of recognition. The twin girls scrambled to hide behind their mother's worn coat, whispering urgently to each other about the tall man in the expensive suit who was staring at them. One of the girls possessed the exact same piercing green eyes as Richard, while the other had the shy, gentle smile that he remembered so vividly as Felicity's most beautiful inheritance. Richard sank to his knees right there on the dirty, wet sidewalk, his expensive trousers soaking up the grime of the city as he reached out a trembling hand. "Felicity, it is me, Richard, your husband," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words and years of accumulated grief. She looked at him with genuine confusion, her brow furrowed as if he were a complete stranger speaking a foreign language that held no meaning for her. The girls pressed themselves even tighter against their mother, clearly frightened by the emotional intensity radiating from the man kneeling before them in the rain. "I am sorry, sir. But you must be mistaken in confusing me with someone else," she replied, nervously smoothing back her long, tangled brown hair. "My name is Claire, and my husband Paul went away on a business trip several months ago to find us a better life." The world Richard knew seemed to crumble into dust at her feet as he realized she truly had no memory of who he was or the life they had shared. A thin, jagged scar across her temple caught his attention, a mark that certainly had not been there before her mysterious disappearance 8 years ago. What on earth had happened to his wife to erase his existence from her mind and replace it with a phantom named Paul? "Mama sometimes forgets very important things," one of the twins whispered to her sister, loud enough for Richard to catch the heartbreaking confession. He felt a mixture of profound relief for having found them and absolute despair for the tragic condition in which they were currently existing. He noticed that Felicity had lost a significant amount of weight. Her skin looked parched from exposure to the elements, and her hands were calloused like someone who performed heavy labor. I would like to help you and your children, and I can pay for a warm meal and a safe place to sleep tonight," he offered, struggling to keep his voice steady. Felicity hesitated, looking down at her hungry daughters. One of them had deep shadows under her eyes and was coughing occasionally, clearly in need of medical attention. "We do not accept charity from strangers," she said with a flickering spark of her old pride. But her voice faltered when the more fragile child tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, I am so very hungry," the little girl murmured, her voice small and weak against the roar of the city's evening traffic. Richard's heart broke into a million pieces at the sound of his daughter begging for food, daughters he had never even known existed until this miraculous, terrible moment. "It is not charity. You simply remind me of someone very special I lost a long time ago, and I want to honor her memory," he lied gently. His strategy seemed to work. As Felicity looked at her daughters again, sighed deeply, and finally stood up with a weary nod of agreement. "Only for tonight," she conceded, taking the small hands of the girls as they followed Richard toward the idling car. Richard drove them to a quiet, upscale hotel on the edge of the city, intentionally choosing a place far from his grand estate to avoid overwhelming them with his wealth. During the drive, he watched through the rearview mirror as the twins stared in wide-eyed wonder at the soft leather interior and the glowing dashboard lights. "What are your names?" he asked, gently, trying to build a bridge of trust between himself and these two precious strangers who shared his blood. "I am Maya, and she is Mia," replied the more talkative of the two, her voice filled with a sudden, cautious curiosity. "We were born on the very same day, but I was born first by exactly 3 minutes," she added with a tiny, proud smile. Mia, the quieter twin, protested softly, making Richard smile for the first time in more years than he could accurately count or remember. Felicity remained silent during the entire journey, watching him with a lingering sense of suspicion while occasionally pressing her hand against her scarred temple as if she were in pain. At the hotel, Richard paid for 2 adjoining rooms, ensuring he would be close enough to help if they needed anything during the night. After the girls went into the bathroom to take a warm bath, Richard took the opportunity to speak with Felicity alone in the small living area. "How long have you been living on the streets?" he asked, his heart aching at her hollowed-out appearance. "Only a few months. We lost our small apartment when Paul stopped sending money from his travels," she answered, looking out at the city lights. Richard pressed further, asking where they had lived before that, and she massaged her temple again, her expression becoming clouded and lost. "In a place called Fairhaven, I think. Or at least, that is where I remember waking up a long time ago," she said, her voice trailing off into uncertainty. Richard knew Fairhaven well, as it was a small coastal town where he had concentrated much of his search in the early years. How could she have been so close for all this time without his private investigators ever finding a single trace of her? "Do you remember how you arrived in Fairhaven?" he asked softly, watching her face for any flicker of the woman he had married. "Not very well. I believe there was a car accident during a terrible storm, and a kind woman named Mrs. Higgins found me," she explained. Mrs. Higgins was a retired nurse who had cared for her when she was confused and injured, helping her through a difficult pregnancy with the twins. The pieces began to fit together in Richard's mind. Felicity had clearly suffered a severe head trauma that had wiped away her previous identity. This would explain why she didn't recognize him, and why she believed she was a woman named Claire with a different past. "And this man, Paul, that you mentioned?" Richard asked, his chest tightening with a sudden, sharp surge of jealousy that he tried to suppress. Felicity's expression darkened as she recalled the man who had entered their lives when the twins were already 3 years old. "He appeared one day and claimed he knew me from before the accident, telling me that we were married and had a life together," she whispered. Mrs. Higgins had never liked him, but Felicity had been so alone and desperate for stability that she had accepted his story without question. Richard realized with a cold fury that his wife had been the victim of a predator who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. "Did he treat you well?" Richard asked, his voice low and dangerous, though he was careful not to direct his anger toward Felicity herself. In the beginning, yes, but then he began to drink heavily and would shout at the girls, saying they were not his children, she admitted. One day, he simply vanished, taking what little money they had saved and leaving them to face eviction and the harsh reality of the streets. Richard felt a rage so intense he had to step out onto the small balcony for a moment to breathe the cold night air and regain his composure. When he returned, the twins were emerging from the bathroom, clean and wrapped in oversized hotel towels that looked like regal white gowns. "Daddy, look at us!" Maya shouted with excitement, but then she caught herself and her face fell with a sudden, apologetic realization. "I am sorry, sir. I forgot for a second that you were not our daddy," she whispered, her eyes downcast as she clutched the towel. That innocent mistake made Richard's heart race with a bittersweet hope, as if the child's instinct knew the truth even if her mind did not. "Do not worry. You can call me whatever makes you feel the most comfortable and safe," he said, offering them a gentle smile. Mia, the shy one, approached him slowly and touched the soft fabric of his silk shirt with a look of genuine amazement. "Your clothes are so soft," she commented quietly, her voice filled with a childlike wonder that made Richard want to weep for her. Paul always wore rough clothes that smelled of old cigarettes and sour beer, a stark contrast to the man who now stood before them. During dinner, Richard observed every gesture of his daughters, noting how Maya was the inquisitive one who asked endless questions about his life. Maya was the observer, the sensitive soul who frequently checked on her mother to make sure she was okay and not in any pain. "Why does Mama sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night?" Maya asked innocently, causing Felicity to blush with deep embarrassment. "Nightmares are a natural response to difficult experiences," Richard explained gently, reaching across the table to touch Felicity's hand, though she pulled away. He asked if they had ever sought medical help for her memory loss or the recurring nightmares that plagued her sleep. "We never had the money for a doctor," Felicity replied, lowering her eyes as she focused on the remains of her meal. "What if I were to pay for a consultation as a way of thanking you for your company tonight?" he suggested, hoping she would accept. Felicity hesitated, but her concern for her own health and the well-being of her daughters finally outweighed her stubborn, misplaced sense of pride. "Perhaps that would be a good idea," she agreed finally, her voice weary as the adrenaline of the day began to fade into exhaustion. That night, Richard stayed awake in the adjoining room, listening through the thin wall to the soft sounds of his family settling into bed. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he heard a muffled scream and Felicity's voice crying out his name over and over again in her sleep. She was pleading for forgiveness for something he didn't understand, her voice filled with an ancient, lingering pain that tore at his heart. He heard Maya whispering to her mother, asking if she was dreaming about the man from her old stories, the man named Richard. This meant that his name was buried deep within her subconscious mind, waiting for the right moment to be brought back to the surface. The next morning, Richard arranged an appointment with the best neurologist in New York City, a man renowned for treating complex cases of amnesia. After a series of extensive tests, the doctor confirmed that Felicity had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury that affected her long-term memory access. It is possible that some memories will return with time and the proper emotional stimuli, the doctor explained in his quiet professional office. However, he warned Richard that it would be a slow and delicate process that might never result in a full recovery of her past. While Felicity was speaking with the neurologist, Richard took the twins to a small park near the medical center to talk to them privately. "Do you remember anything from when you were very little babies?" he asked, sitting on a bench as they played with some fallen leaves. "Only what Mrs. Higgins told us," Maya said, her eyes bright with the stories she had been told about their mysterious beginning. She told them they were born during a terrible thunderstorm and that their mother had been very sick for a long time afterward. "Mrs. Higgins is the best. She used to bake us chocolate cakes and tell us stories about the stars," Mia added with nostalgia. Richard felt a sudden deep pang in his chest for the nurse who had stepped in to raise his children when he was miles away. "Why are you no longer with her?" he asked, wanting to understand the timeline of their journey from Fairhaven to New York. The girls exchanged a sad look before Maya answered that the kind nurse had become very old and had to move into a care home. She could no longer look after them. And that was when the man named Paul had convinced their mother to move to the big city. Richard realized that Mrs. Higgins was the key to understanding everything that had happened during those missing 8 years of their lives. "Would you like to go and visit her?" he asked, seeing the girls' faces light up with a hope that was almost blinding in its intensity. "Can we really?" Maya asked, while Richard promised them that they would go as soon as their mother was feeling a little bit stronger. Over the following weeks, Richard became a constant and supportive presence in their lives, providing them with a comfortable apartment and the best schools. He paid for everything, ensuring they had nutritious food and beautiful clothes, while he accompanied Felicity to every single medical and therapy appointment. He slowly began to introduce elements of their shared past, playing music they once loved and cooking the meals she had once enjoyed. Sometimes he saw a brief flash of recognition in her eyes, a fleeting moment where the veil of amnesia seemed to thin and almost break. One day, while organizing some old investigation files, Richard found a specific folder detailing inconsistencies in the original search for his missing wife. His previous investigator had documented several strange occurrences, such as anonymous phone calls giving false leads and sightings in distant cities that led nowhere. At the time, Richard had been too blinded by his own grief to realize that someone had been deliberately sabotaging his efforts to find her. Now, with a clearer mind, he began to suspect that her disappearance had not been a simple accident but a calculated plot. Richard decided to hire a new investigator, one who was completely unaffiliated with his family or his company, to look into these old leads. He needed to know who had conspired to keep him away from his wife and daughters for nearly a decade of their lives. Meanwhile, Felicity's medical progress was slow but consistent, and the doctor suggested she visit familiar places to help stimulate her sleeping memories. Richard knew this meant taking her back to the grand estate where they had lived, but he feared the experience might be too traumatic. "How do you feel about Mr. Sterling?" the doctor asked the twins during one of their family counseling sessions. "He is very nice and he makes Mama smile more than anyone else we have ever known," Maya responded with a shy, genuine grin. "And he knows things about us that nobody else seems to know," Mia added thoughtfully, looking at Richard with a curious expression. The doctor asked what kind of things she meant, and she explained how he knew exactly how she liked. Her feet tickled. He also knew that Maya was terrified of loud thunder, but absolutely loved the smell of the rain on the hot pavement in summer. The neurologist looked at Richard with a professional interest, noting that these were very specific details for a man who had only known them for weeks. Richard felt cornered by the truth and realized it was finally time to reveal his identity to the doctor in a private conversation. In the quiet confines of the consultation room, Richard told the entire story, from their wedding to her disappearance and his desperate 8-year search. The doctor listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes as the pieces of the complex puzzle finally began to fall into their proper places. "This explains the deep emotional connection she shows towards you, even if she cannot consciously place your face or your name," the doctor said. Her brain was recognizing him on a subconscious level, even while the conscious barriers of her trauma remained firmly and stubbornly in place. The doctor advised Richard to continue the gradual exposure, but suggested it might be time to introduce more direct evidence of their past life. "You must tell her the truth, Richard, because maintaining the lie might eventually cause more harm than the revelation itself," the doctor warned. That night, Richard gathered his courage and showed Felicity an old framed photograph of their wedding day, his heart racing with a nervous anticipation. She studied the image for several long minutes, her fingers delicately tracing the face of the groom and the radiant bride in the photo. "This man looks exactly like you," she commented softly, her voice filled with a strange and distant sort of wonder. "Because it is me, Felicity, and that beautiful woman in the white dress is you. We were married 10 years ago in Virginia." She laughed, but it was a hollow, mirthless sound that chilled him to the bone as she shook her head in total disbelief. "That is impossible. I would know if I were married to a man like you," she insisted, her voice rising with a sudden defenselessness. Richard explained the accident, her disappearance while pregnant, and how he had spent every waking moment of the last 8 years searching for her. Her expression changed drastically as she turned pale, her hands beginning to shake as she clutched the edges of the photograph until her knuckles turned white. "You are lying to me. Paul told me my husband died in a terrible crash, and that is why I could not remember." "Paul lied to you, Felicity. He took advantage of your confusion to build a fake life and keep you away from the truth." "No, no, no, no!" she screamed, covering her ears as she began to rock back and forth on the sofa in a state of panic. The twins ran into the room when they heard their mother's cries, finding her in a state of distress while Richard tried to comfort her. "What is happening? Why is Mama crying?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with fear as she looked between the two adults she trusted. Richard realized he had pushed too hard and too fast, forcing a revelation that her fragile mind was not yet ready to fully accept. "I am going to leave for a few days to give you some space," he said softly, placing the car keys on the table. He promised to return when they were ready to talk, but he made sure that they would be well cared for in his absence. He hired a private nurse and a kind nanny to assist Felicity and the twins while he stayed at a nearby hotel. During those lonely days, the new investigator he had hired returned with information that was even more disturbing than he had originally imagined. The sabotage of his original search had been orchestrated by someone very close to him, someone who had access to his private records. It was his own sister, Penelope, who had hired the fake investigators and spread the false leads to keep him from finding Felicity. "Apparently she wanted your wife to stay missing because of the inheritance and her own personal prejudices," the investigator explained with a grim expression. Richard had always trusted his sister blindly, believing she was the one person who truly supported him during the darkest hours of his life. She had pretended to cry with him while secretly making sure he would never see his wife or his children ever again. Determined to confront Penelope, Richard arranged a meeting at their family's corporate headquarters, his heart filled with a cold and focused determination. He arrived prepared with all the evidence the investigator had collected. His eyes narrowed as he watched his sister enter the opulent boardroom. "Richard, it is so good to see you. How is the search for Felicity going?" she asked with a practiced false concern. "The search is over, Penelope. I have found her," he said, throwing the thick folder of incriminating documents onto the polished mahogany table. Her expression shifted subtly, but she quickly regained her composure, though her eyes betrayed a sudden flickering sense of calculated panic. "I have no idea what you are talking about. These documents must be some kind of elaborate mistake," she lied, her voice finally beginning to waver. 8 years, Penelope. For 8 long years you watched me suffer while you actively worked to keep my family living in poverty." Richard's voice rose to a thunderous roar as the weight of her betrayal finally crashed down upon him in that cold, empty room. "You destroyed my life. You destroyed Felicity's life. And my daughters grew up begging on the streets because of your incredible greed." "Your daughters?" Penelope asked, her voice filled with a genuine surprise that indicated she hadn't known about the twins. "Felicity was pregnant with twins when she disappeared. Children who spent years in hunger because you wanted to protect your share of the estate." The gravity of her actions finally seemed to hit her as she realized she hadn't just sabotaged a marriage, but had endangered children. I did not know about the children," she whispered, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she sank into a chair. "Does that make your betrayal any less monstrous?" Richard asked with a bitter contempt that made Penelope flinch as if he had struck her. She tried to justify her actions by claiming that Felicity wasn't good enough for their family, coming from such a humble and simple background. Do not you dare use class prejudice to justify 8 years of calculated cruelty and systemic lies, Richard hissed, his eyes burning with fury. Their heated discussion was interrupted when Richard's assistant entered the room with a look of urgent concern and a quiet, hesitant apology. I am sorry to interrupt, sir, but there is an elderly woman here who says it is a matter of extreme and immediate importance. She identified herself as Mrs. Higgins, and Richard immediately ordered his assistant to bring the woman into the boardroom without any further delay. A frail woman entered, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, but her eyes were sharp and filled with a fierce, protective determination. So, you are the Richard I have heard so much about, she said, examining him from head to toe with a critical, knowing look. It took you a very long time to find us, young man. Longer than a husband should ever take to find his family. Are you Mrs. Higgins? Richard asked, moving toward her with a sense of profound reverence for the woman who had saved his daughters. Yes, and I am here because my girl is suffering. She called me yesterday crying, saying a man was telling her impossible things. Felicity had reached out to the nurse she trusted, seeking some form of confirmation for the world-shaking claims Richard had made. Mrs. Higgins studied Richard's face before asking him to prove his identity, as she wasn't about to hand over her girl to another predator. Richard showed her the same wedding photos and documents, and the old nurse examined them carefully, comparing the dates and the smallest details. These photos look authentic, she admitted, but she wanted to know how she could be sure he wasn't another man like Paul. Richard asked what she meant, and she explained how Paul had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be Felicity's husband without a shred of proof. Felicity was so confused and desperate that she simply accepted his story because she had nowhere else to turn for help. Why did you not go to the authorities or try to find her real family? Richard asked, his voice soft with a lingering sadness. Mrs. Higgins sighed, explaining that she was just a retired nurse with no resources to fight a legal battle against a man like Paul. Furthermore, whenever she tried to register the twins or seek official help, a man would appear and threaten them with legal trouble. Richard and Penelope locked eyes as the nurse described a man in an expensive suit who claimed Felicity was wanted for crimes she didn't commit. He told me that her family had disowned her, and that if I went to the police, she would be taken away to prison. Richard felt a cold chill as he realized his sister had not only sabotaged the search, but had actively terrorized an old woman and a traumatized mother. Penelope, did you hire someone to threaten Mrs. Higgins and keep her from seeking help? Richard asked, his voice trembling with a new level of rage. I did not threaten anyone. I simply hired an attorney to discourage any official registration that might cause a public scandal for our family. A scandal? Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. You kept 2 children living in fear of the law just to protect our family's reputation and your own twisted sense of social standing. By your actions, these children grew up believing their mother was a fugitive from justice, Mrs. Higgins added, striking her cane against the floor. Richard turned back to the nurse and asked if she would help him prove the truth to Felicity in a way she could accept. I can try, but she is very fragile right now, and any more pressure might cause her mind to break completely, the nurse warned. Richard agreed to be patient, promising to follow whatever path was necessary to bring his wife back to the light of the truth. Mrs. Higgins settled into a chair and began to recount the night she found Felicity, 8 long and difficult years ago. It was a night of a terrible freezing storm, and I was finishing my shift at the clinic when I heard a weak knocking at the door. She found a pregnant woman, soaked to the bone and bleeding from a serious head wound, barely able to stand or speak a word. She spoke random names and cried for forgiveness for things that made no sense at all. She was clearly in a state of shock. The twins were born prematurely due to the stress of the accident, and the delivery had been incredibly difficult for everyone involved. Felicity had lost a lot of blood and remained unconscious for 2 weeks, waking up with no memory of her previous life or her name. Richard felt tears prickling his eyes as he realized that while he was spending a fortune on useless investigators, a retired nurse was saving his family. Mrs. Higgins, I can never truly repay you for what you have done for my wife and my daughters, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You owe me nothing. I did what any decent human being would do in such a desperate and tragic situation, she replied. However, those girls had brought more joy to her lonely life than he could ever imagine, and they still called her Grandma Higgins. Richard asked why they had eventually left her care, and the nurse's expression turned sad as she spoke of her declining health. I had several minor strokes and could no longer look after the children properly. When Paul appeared with promises of stability, I thought it was for the best. She had always suspected Paul was a liar, but as an old sick woman, she had no power to stop him from taking them away. He discouraged all my visits, and eventually moved them to the city, and I lost contact with them until that desperate phone call yesterday. Penelope, who had remained uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke up to offer a weak and shallow apology for the inconvenience she had caused. Inconvenience? Mrs. Higgins snapped, her eyes flashing with a righteous and fiery anger that silenced the room. You separated a family for 8 years and condemned children to the streets. That is not an inconvenience. It is a grave sin against humanity. Richard intervened before the situation escalated further, asking Mrs. Higgins to visit Felicity and help bridge the gap between her false memories and the truth. Over the next few days, the nurse visited the apartment daily, talking gently to Felicity about the night they first met and the truth about Paul. Claire, dear, have you ever wondered why you have such vivid nightmares about a man named Richard? The nurse asked during one of their quiet afternoons. They are just confusing dreams, Grandma. They do not mean anything at all, Felicity insisted, though her hands were trembling as she held her tea. And if they do mean something, what if your brain is trying to tell you something that your heart already knows is true? Maya, who was playing nearby, looked up and mentioned how Paul used to lie to them all the time about simple things. He said he was going to buy us ice cream, and then he never came back for 3 days. The little girl added, with a sad frown. Mia mentioned how Mr. Sterling treated them like they were special, and how he always seemed to know exactly what they needed. And he smells nice. Not like Paul did, Mia added, making the old nurse chuckle despite the gravity of the conversation they were having. Felicity watched the girls with a thoughtful expression, noticing how happy they seemed whenever Richard was around to play with them. I feel strangely safe when he is near me, Grandma. It is a feeling of safety that I have not felt in a very long time. Mrs. Higgins encouraged her to give Richard a chance to show her the evidence he had brought, reminding her that she deserved to know the truth. That night, Felicity spent hours looking at a specific photo Richard had left, a photo of them in a park on a sunny spring afternoon. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. To my Felicity, who made this the happiest day of my life. Our first date, March 15th. The date mentioned triggered a sudden, sharp spark in her clouded memory, a fleeting image of yellow flowers and a man's gentle laughter. She remembered a day of pure joy, and a man who had made her laugh until her stomach ached, though the face was still a bit blurry. She called Mrs. Higgins and asked if she had said anything about the date of March 15th on the night of the accident. You repeated that date over and over in your delirium, saying you had forgotten something very important, the nurse confirmed over the phone. Felicity's heart raced as she realized the date on the photo matched the words she had spoken when she was at her most vulnerable. This could not be a simple coincidence, and she realized she needed to speak with Richard again, but this time with Grandma Higgins present. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon in the apartment, and Richard arrived looking nervous, carrying a small wooden box of personal items. Thank you for coming, Felicity said. her voice still hesitant, but no longer filled with the sharp, defensive edge of fear she had shown before. "Thank you for giving me this chance to explain," Richard replied, placing the box on the coffee table. Mrs. Higgins sat between them, acting as a calm mediator as Richard began to open the box, revealing items that were like sacred treasures of a lost life. The first item was their original marriage certificate, a document that could be easily verified at the city hall where they had exchanged their vows. Felicity examined the paper, her eyes tracing her own signature, which looked remarkably like the handwriting of a stranger she used to know. The second item was a delicate diamond engagement ring, which Richard explained she always wore on her right hand to keep her left hand free for the wedding band. "I had it specially made for you because your fingers are so small and elegant," he whispered. Felicity looked down at her own hands and noticed a very faint, circular mark on her right ring finger, as if a ring had been there for years. "May I try it on?" she asked, and when Richard handed it to her, the ring slid onto her finger as if it were coming home. "How is this possible?" she murmured, her eyes filling with a sudden, overwhelming confusion that was slowly turning into a profound and life-changing realization. The third item in the box made the twins run closer to the table. It was a thick photo album filled with hundreds of pictures of the couple. "Mama, look! You are wearing the same pearl necklace you have in your jewelry pouch!" Maya shouted. Felicity touched the small pearl necklace she had managed to keep even during their darkest days on the streets, never knowing why she felt so attached to it. "That was my gift to you for our first anniversary," Richard explained, his eyes misty with the memory of that happy evening so long ago. "And this photo?" Mia asked, pointing to a picture of a very pregnant Felicity smiling brightly as she sat in a nursery filled with toys. "That was taken just 2 weeks before you disappeared." "You were 7 months pregnant with the twins?" Richard said, his voice thick with a father's love. The girls were amazed to see that they had been expected and loved long before they were born. "Why do I not remember being this happy?" Felicity asked, looking at the radiant woman in the photograph, who seemed to glow with a pure, unclouded joy. "Because the trauma of the accident fixed the negative experiences in your mind while erasing the beautiful ones," Richard explained with a gentle, patient compassion. Mrs. Higgins leaned forward and asked Felicity if she could see the woman in the photo. A woman who was clearly not alone or afraid. "No, she looks very much in love," Felicity admitted, her voice trembling as the wall of her amnesia began to crumble into 1,000 pieces. Richard told her about the names they had chosen together, Maya and Mia. Names that were meant to be unique but harmonious. "And our room? What was it going to look like?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with a sudden desperate hunger for the history she had never known. Richard described a room painted in soft lavender and white, with tiny glow-in-the-dark stars that Felicity had hand-painted on the ceiling for them. "Mama can paint?" Mia asked, and Richard told them that their mother was a very talented artist who had painted many beautiful landscapes for their home. Felicity felt a sudden, vivid image of a paintbrush in her hand and the smell of linseed oil and turpentine filling a sunlit, airy studio. You used to sing in the shower," she said suddenly, her voice filled with a shock of genuine and unexpected recognition. Richard smiled widely, admitting that he sang every single morning and that she used to complain he woke her up far too early with his off-key tunes. She remembered the sensation of waking up next to someone dear, the smell of fresh coffee, and the sound of shared laughter over a burnt breakfast. "Oh my God," she whispered, covering her face with her hands as the truth finally broke through the darkness of her long, cold 8-year winter. It was all true. She was Felicity Sterling, and this man was her husband. And they had been separated by a cruelty she was only beginning to grasp. Richard knelt beside her, hesitant to touch her without permission, but his eyes were filled with an eternal, unchanging devotion. "I never stopped looking for you, Felicity. I never stopped loving you for even a single second of those 8 long years," he promised. Maya was the first to throw her arms around him, followed quickly by Mia, and finally Felicity joined the embrace, her tears soaking into his expensive silk shirt. I missed you every single day, even when I did not know your name or what you looked like, she whispered into his ear. Mrs. Higgins watched the scene with tears streaming down her aged face, knowing her mission to protect her girl had finally reached its beautiful conclusion. Well, I think my work here is finally done, the nurse said, standing up with the help of her sturdy wooden cane. Grandma Higgins, where are you going? Mia asked, clutching the nurse's hand with a sudden, sharp fear of losing another person she loved deeply. Back to my home, dear. You have your real family now, and you do not need an old woman like me in your way, Mrs. Higgins, Richard intervened, standing up and taking the nurse's hand with a look of profound and eternal gratitude. You will always be a part of this family. You saved them when I could not, and that makes you one of us forever. He offered her a suite in their home, promising she would never be lonely or without a family again as long as he drew breath. Over the following months, the integration of the family was a gradual and delicate process that required immense patience and specialized professional support. Richard sold his cold, lonely mansion and bought a smaller, more welcoming estate with a beautiful garden and a special ground-floor apartment for Mrs. Higgins. The twins adapted remarkably fast to their new reality, though they still had moments where they struggled to believe their good fortune was actually real. Maya, ever the curious one, asked endless questions about their ancestors, while Mia dedicated herself to making sure her mother never felt overwhelmed or alone. Felicity still had occasional lapses in her memory, but they became less frequent as she felt more secure in her new, loving environment. The expert medical support, combined with intensive family therapy and a stable home life, accelerated her recovery in ways the doctors had never thought possible. One afternoon, while they were gardening together, Felicity stopped and looked at Richard with a sudden, clear light of total and unclouded recognition in her eyes. I remember our very first kiss, Richard. It was under that old oak tree in the park near the university where we met. He smiled, recalling how nervous he had been and how he had accidentally spilled his iced tea all over her favorite white summer blouse. And you just laughed, instead of being angry. That was the exact moment I knew I was going to love you forever. And I knew I loved you because you listened to me talk about my dreams for 3 hours without ever trying to interrupt me, she added. The memories continued to return in waves, some vivid and bright, others fragmented like old film, but all of them helping to rebuild the woman she used to be. However, the issue of Penelope remained a very sensitive and difficult point for the entire family to navigate or resolve with any ease. Richard's sister had lost her position in the family company and was facing serious legal consequences for the crimes of fraud and criminal sabotage she had committed. Richard, influenced by Felicity's naturally forgiving soul, decided to offer his sister a final, desperate chance at a path toward redemption. She needs psychological help, Richard, not just a prison cell. A healthy person does not do what she did to people she supposedly loves. She nearly destroyed our lives, Felicity. She kept our daughters in poverty for her own selfish and greedy gain, Richard argued with a lingering bitterness. And if we destroy her in return, are we not just as bad as she was? Felicity asked, her voice calm and filled with a profound wisdom. She wanted their daughters to see that forgiveness was possible even in the most extreme and difficult circumstances of human betrayal and deep-seated cruelty. Richard eventually agreed to pay for Penelope's long-term psychological treatment, provided she remained far away from the family until she showed real change. Meanwhile, their family life settled into a healthy and vibrant routine that was filled with more laughter than Richard had heard in a decade. The twins attended an excellent private school where they excelled in their studies and made many new friends who knew nothing of their difficult past. Maya showed a special talent for the arts, just like her mother, while Mia demonstrated a sharp and impressive aptitude for mathematics and science. "Daddy, Why did it take you so very long to find us? Maya asked one evening during a quiet family dinner in their sunlit dining room. The question caught Richard by surprise, and he looked at Felicity, wondering how much of the dark truth they should share with such young minds. Sometimes the people we love make very bad choices because they are afraid or confused about what is truly important in this life, Felicity explained. She told them their father had been misled by someone who didn't want their family to be together, but that love had eventually found a way. Because not everyone knows how to be happy for others when they are suffering in their own hearts, Richard added, his voice soft and thoughtful. Was it like Paul? Was that person like him? Mia asked, her voice filled with a child's desire to categorize the world into good and bad. Richard confirmed that some people lose their way, but that the family was now safe and protected, and that was all that mattered. Years passed, and the Sterling family found a beautiful and lasting balance that was built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. Richard resumed his business activities with a renewed energy, but this time his primary motivation was to use his wealth for a much greater social purpose. He began to invest heavily in social projects, aimed at reuniting separated families and providing support for women who had suffered from similar traumatic experiences. Felicity, with her memories mostly restored, decided to go back to school to finish her nursing degree and eventually specialized in neurological rehabilitation for trauma victims. I want to turn my years of pain into a purpose that helps others find their way back to themselves, she explained. Mrs. Higgins, despite her advancing age, remained the emotional pillar of the household, a grandmother figure who filled their home with wisdom and ancient stories. She taught the twins her secret recipes and offered the kind of life advice that can only be earned through decades of selfless service to others. One evening, exactly 1 year after their miraculous reunion, Richard found Felicity standing on the balcony, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "About how life can change so drastically in such a short amount of time," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "A year ago, I was begging for a few cents to buy bread, and tonight I have everything I ever dared to dream of and more. Do you regret anything about the years we lost?" Richard asked, his voice filled with a lingering and quiet sort of sorrow for the time gone. Felicity reflected carefully before answering that she did not regret the journey, because the suffering had taught them the true value of what they now possessed. The girls had learned deep empathy from their time on the streets, and she had discovered a strength she never knew was hidden within her soul. And you, Richard, you proved that true love never gives up, even when the rest of the world says it is time to move on. And I learned that family is not just about blood. Mrs. Higgins will always be as much a part of us as anyone else, Richard added. 2 more years passed before Penelope showed enough genuine progress in her therapy to be considered safe for a very limited and supervised family interaction. When they finally met again, she was a visibly transformed woman, her face stripped of the arrogant mask of wealth and replaced by a humble regret. "Richard, Felicity, I do not expect you to ever truly forgive me for the monstrous things I did to you both," she said with tears in her eyes. "What I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know that I spend every single day trying to be a better person." "Regret is only the first step, Penelope. Real change is what truly matters in the eyes of those you have hurt so deeply," Felicity responded. Penelope accepted all the conditions Richard set for her, including limited visits and no unsupervised time with the twins under any circumstances whatsoever. Maya and Mia, now 9 years old, were officially introduced to their biological aunt after months of careful psychological preparation and family discussion. "Aunt Penelope, why did you want to separate our family?" Maya asked, with the devastating and uncomfortable honesty that only a child can possess. Penelope knelt down so she could look the girls in the eyes, her voice trembling as she spoke the difficult and painful truth. "Because I was a very selfish person who was jealous of the happiness your mother and father shared with each other. She had wanted to be the most important person in her brother's life and had felt forgotten when he started his own beautiful family. But you could have been special as our aunt, too. Aunts are very important people in a family, Mia observed with a quiet logic. Penelope realized the girls were right, and she had traded a lifetime of love for a few years of bitter and lonely control over an estate. You're right. And I made a terrible mistake by not understanding that love is not something you have to compete for or steal. Are you going to make that same mistake again? Maya asked, her eyes searching her aunt's face for any hint of the old, cold deception. Penelope promised she would never do anything to hurt them again, and she asked if she could help them with their school projects as a start. Gradually, Penelope was reintegrated into the family dynamic, though the process was intentionally slow and always prioritized the emotional safety of the girls. During this time, another ghost from their past briefly resurfaced: Paul, the man who had exploited Felicity's amnesia for his own selfish and cruel ends. He appeared at their front gate one evening, looking disheveled and demanding to see his daughters and his wife Claire. Richard went out to confront him personally, while Felicity kept the girls safely inside the house and away from the man's aggressive and loud shouting. You have no rights here, Paul. You abandoned them on the street and took their last bits of money, Richard said, his voice cold. Paul tried to claim he had raised the girls for 4 years and that he deserved to be a part of their new, wealthy life. You did not raise them. You used them and their mother when they were at their most vulnerable and had no one else to turn to. Richard warned him that if he did not leave the property immediately, the police would be called to handle his trespassing and harassment. Mrs. Higgins appeared behind Richard, brandishing her heavy wooden cane with a surprising and fierce strength for a woman of her advanced age. You! She shouted at Paul. You absolute predator! How dare you show your face here after what you did to my girl and those babies? Paul seemed genuinely surprised to see the nurse alive, as he had told Felicity she had passed away to keep them from ever returning. I am very much alive, you liar, and if you do not leave right now, I will show you exactly how much life is left in me. Paul realized he would find no sympathy or money there, and finally slunk away into the night, never to be seen again. The incident with Paul made the family realize there were still many legal loose ends that needed to be tied up to ensure their future. Richard hired a team of lawyers to officially establish his paternity of the twins and to strip Paul of any potential legal claims he might try. The DNA tests confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. Richard was the biological father of Maya and Mia, the children of his soul. The legal documents were finally updated, and for the first time in their lives, the girls were officially given the surname Sterling in a small ceremony. Now we are officially a family, Maya declared with a triumphant grin as she held the new legal papers in her small hands. We were always a family, Maya. The papers just told the rest of the world what our hearts have known for a long time, Felicity corrected. The legal process also revealed that Paul had forged many documents to claim social benefits and was currently being investigated for multiple counts of identity fraud. This did not make Felicity happy, as she was a woman of immense compassion, but she understood that everyone must eventually face the consequences of their choices. I do not want to see him suffer, Richard, but I want our daughters to be safe from his influence forever, she said quietly. Richard promised that they would always be protected, and he increased the security of their estate to give her a lasting peace of mind. Life continued its natural course, and the twins blossomed into remarkable young women who were deeply influenced by their family's unique and difficult history. Maya pursued her passion for painting, while Mia became a leader in her school's science club, always looking for ways to solve practical problems. Felicity, in addition to her work as a nurse, began to lecture at universities about the psychological impact of trauma and the importance of family support. Her personal experience, combined with her professional training, made her one of the most sought-after experts in the field of neurological rehabilitation and trauma. "I am turning my pain into medicine for others," she told Richard one night after a successful and moving presentation. Mrs. Higgins, though she was now over 80 years old, remained a vibrant and essential part of the Sterling household and its daily rhythms. She taught the girls how to knit and how to listen to the birds in the garden, sharing the quiet wisdom of a life well lived. One night, nearly 3 years after the reunion, Richard and Felicity were sitting together when they realized they wanted to expand their family even further. "We always wanted a house full of children, and now that the girls are older, we have so much love to give," Richard suggested. Felicity agreed, though she was mindful of her age and the trauma her body had endured during her previous and difficult pregnancy. They decided to discuss the possibility of a new baby with the twins, wanting them to feel included in such a major and life-changing family decision. "It would be so wonderful to have a little brother or sister to look after," Maya exclaimed, her face lighting up with a sudden joy. "We have plenty of room, and Grandma Higgins would love to have a baby in the house again," Mia added with a practical and supportive nod. The idea of a new baby brought a fresh energy to the household, and even Mrs. Higgins began to knit tiny, soft sweaters in anticipation of a new arrival. Felicity became pregnant toward the end of their 4th year together, and the entire family celebrated the news with tears of happiness. The pregnancy was closely monitored by the best doctors, and this time Richard was able to be present for every single ultrasound and medical checkup. He held Felicity's hand as they saw the tiny heartbeat on the screen, a moment he had missed when Maya and Mia were growing within her. The twins were the most dedicated assistants their mother could ever ask for, reading books on fetal development and preparing the nursery with immense care. They talked to the baby every single night, telling him stories about their family and promising to be the best big sisters in the entire world. Mrs. Higgins, despite her arthritis, finished a beautiful white lace blanket that she had been working on for months with great determination. In the middle of the 5th year after the reunion, a healthy baby boy named Gabriel was born into a room filled with love and immense gratitude. Richard was the first to hold his son, a moment of pure and unadulterated healing that seemed to bridge the gap of all the years he had lost. "He is perfect, Felicity. He is the final piece of our beautiful and complicated puzzle," Richard whispered, his eyes shining with a father's pride. Maya and Mia were allowed to hold their brother shortly after, and they looked at him with a protective love that was truly beautiful to behold. "We will always take care of you, Gabriel," they promised, their voices soft as they cradled the tiny, sleeping infant. Mrs. Higgins, though her physical strength was fading, showed a remarkable and instinctive grandmotherly energy when it came to the new baby in the house. She would sit in her rocking chair, humming old lullabies to Gabriel, her eyes filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding or explanation. "A new baby brings a new life to an old heart," she would say, her smile as bright as the morning sun over the garden. The presence of Gabriel seemed to have a therapeutic effect on the entire family, softening the remaining edges of their past traumas and griefs. Even Penelope was allowed to visit the baby, though always under the watchful and careful eyes of Richard and the nursery staff. Seeing her nephew seemed to solidify Penelope's transformation, as she realized the beauty of the life she had once tried so hard to prevent from existing. "He looks just like Richard did when he was a baby," she commented softly, her voice filled with a genuine and heartfelt affection for the child. Richard and Felicity decided that the twins would be Gabriel's life guardians, a special role they created to honor their unique and powerful bond. This meant they would always be a central part of his life, providing guidance and support even as they grew into adulthood and started their own lives. The Sterling family had become a beacon of hope for many others, proving that even the most broken things can be mended with love. As Gabriel grew, the house was filled with the sounds of a toddler's laughter and the energetic footsteps of 2 teenagers who were coming into their own. Maya and Mia were now 16 years old, preparing for university while still remaining deeply committed to their roles as sisters and daughters in their family. They decided to study in New York City so they could remain close to home and continue to support their mother and their aging Grandma Higgins. Richard and Felicity were incredibly proud of the women their daughters had become intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely loyal to those they loved and cared for. "Our daughters are our greatest achievement," Richard told Felicity as they watched the girls playing with Gabriel in the sprawling green garden. However, the 9th year after the reunion brought a bittersweet challenge as Mrs. Higgins began to show signs of a serious and irreversible decline in her health. She had another stroke, which affected her ability to walk and speak clearly, but her spirit remained as strong and as stubborn as it had always been. The family decided to keep her at home, hiring professional nurses to assist them, but they provided the majority of the care and companionship themselves. "You saved us, Grandma, and now we are going to take care of you," Maya whispered, sitting by the old nurse's bedside and reading to her for hours. Gabriel would bring his favorite picture books to her room, showing her the colorful illustrations and making her smile with his innocent, childish chatter. During her final months, Mrs. Higgins had moments of incredible lucidity where she would share her final pieces of wisdom with the children she had raised. "Family is not just the people you are born with. It is the people you choose to stand by when the world gets cold and dark," she said. She told them that her life had been truly blessed because she had found a family in them, even if it had happened in the most unexpected way. Richard and Felicity spent many nights by her side, thanking her for the life she had given back to them through her selfless and courageous actions. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, the entire household felt a profound sense of loss that was tempered by a deep gratitude. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched during her many years as a dedicated nurse and a pillar of the community. Richard established a scholarship fund in her name for young people who wanted to pursue a career in nursing or geriatric care and social work. Mrs. Higgins believed in the power of caring for others, and we want her legacy to continue forever, through the lives of others, he said. The twins took it upon themselves to keep her memory alive by telling Gabriel stories about the woman who had once baked them chocolate cakes in Fairhaven. They even learned how to make those same cakes, filling the house with a familiar and comforting scent that brought back happy memories. 10 years after the reunion, the Sterling family held a special celebration to mark a decade of being back together and to honor their incredible journey of healing. They invited all the doctors, therapists, and friends who had supported them throughout the long and difficult process of rebuilding their lives from the ashes. Richard gave a moving speech about the power of persistence and the fact that true love never truly disappears, even when it is buried under layers of trauma. "A decade ago, I found my family on a street corner, and today I stand here with a wife I adore and 3 children who are my pride." Felicity spoke about the importance of mental health and the fact that recovery is a journey, not a destination, and that love is the best medicine. The twins, now young adults, shared their own perspectives on what they had learned about resilience and the importance of never losing hope in the face of despair. "We learned that even when you are lost, there is always someone looking for you, even if you do not know their name yet," Maya said. "And we learned that family is the most precious thing in the world, something that should never be taken for granted or treated with anything but love." Gabriel, who was now 5 years old, ended the ceremony by releasing 10 white doves into the sky, symbolizing the years of peace and unity they had shared. The event was a testament to the fact that even the most tragic stories can have a beautiful and lasting second act. As they moved into the future, the Sterlings continued to be a force for good in their community, using their resources and their experience to help others find peace. Richard's social foundations grew to help thousands of people, while Felicity's clinic became a world-renowned center for the treatment of complex amnesia and traumatic brain injury. Maya became a successful therapist, specializing in family reunification, and Mia became an engineer who designed specialized equipment for people with neurological disabilities and physical limitations. Gabriel grew up knowing that he was the child of a miracle. a boy who was raised in a home where love was the most important law. They had survived the storm, and they had built a life that was as beautiful and as bright as the stars they once painted. Looking back on the long road we have traveled, I realize that the most profound lessons in life are rarely learned in times of comfort and ease, but rather in the moments when we are tested by the harshest of winds. Life has a way of leading us through valleys of shadow, and in those moments, it is easy to believe that all hope is lost, and that our stories have reached a final, tragic end. However, the true measure of a human soul is not found in how we act when the sun is shining, but in how we hold on to the flicker of love when the world is draped in the deepest of winters. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness or an admission of defeat. It is the ultimate act of courage that allows us to break the chains of the past and walk into a future that is unburdened by the weight of old and bitter grudges. As we grow older and the seasons of our lives begin to change, we come to understand that the wealth of a person is not measured by the size of their estate or the prestige of their name, but by the depth of the connections they have nurtured and the lives they have touched with simple kindness. We must remember that every person we meet is carrying a burden we may never fully understand, and a single act of compassion can be the bridge that leads someone back from the edge of absolute and total despair. Family is the anchor that keeps us steady in the midst of life's most turbulent seas, and while blood may provide the foundation, it is the daily choices of patience, empathy, and sacrifice that build the walls of a true and lasting home. We are all interconnected in a vast and beautiful web of human experience, and our greatest purpose is to be the light for others when they find themselves wandering in the darkness of their own confusion. When we choose to forgive those who have wronged us, we are not necessarily excusing their actions, but we are choosing to liberate our own hearts from the poisonous influence of hatred and the desire for a hollow and destructive revenge. Love is the only force capable of transforming a tragedy into a triumph, and it is the only legacy that truly survives the passage of time and the inevitable fading of our physical presence. May we all have the strength to keep looking for those who are lost, the wisdom to cherish those who are found, and the boundless grace to build a world where every soul feels seen, valued, and profoundly loved. In the end, it is the quiet moments of shared laughter, the steady hand in the middle of a storm, and the unwavering belief in the goodness of others that define a life truly and magnificently well lived.